Let's begin. Today is the third set of lectures for the Honors Economics course for the New Visions programs at Putnam Northern Westchester Boces. And we're going to talk today really about three things. Historically, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between pre-modern and a modern economy. So how did economics work on before the Industrial Revolution? How did they make exchanges? And what changed. And in talking about this, we're also going to talk about the great divergence, the change between, let's say, countries in the West and also then, let's say, countries in the rest of the world, for example, particularly East Asia, South Asia, Africa, and why there's such a big gap between rich and poor in the world and the modern world. And the other thing that I want to talk about, and kind of this is a theoretical angle on today, is the importance of money. And money is important to understand theoretically because the role that money plays in the economy is pretty fundamental in dividing economists into two different camps. There are some people who basically model the economy as a set of exchanges of things, right? Apples and bananas going back and forth. And money is just basically a number that helps us keep the numbers. Other economists think that money is actually really important. The fact that we have a money economy fundamentally changes how the economy works. And there's many different perspectives on that, and we're going to try to flesh them out today to understand, let's say, how money might change everything. So once again, we're going to start talking about the change from a pre-modern to a modern economy around the time of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to introduce, talk about the differences between the rich and poor areas of the world geographically. And then we're going to talk about the role of money. And I should also mention there's two other concepts that will come up today. One is the production possibilities frontier, and the other one is the circular flow model of the economy, which will be used to understand money. So I'm going to start talking about the history of the world by just showing you one graph. And you could say this one graph basically summarizes human history from the dawn of recorded history in 1000, 2000 BC, roughly about a few hundred years before the time of ancient Greece with Socrates, kind of at the dawn of what they would call sometimes the axial age, right up to the present. And if you see this graph, you basically, there's two parts of this graph. There's the relatively, well, not necessarily straight, but a little undulating flat line that goes from 1000 BC to roughly, I would say, 1800 AD. And you might say this is the time of the Malthusian trap, which is that if you see this graph, on the left-hand side you see it graphs income per person, with the income for 1800 being a scale of 1. And on, let's say, the horizontal axis is time. And from 1000 BC to about 1800, there's no material improvement in the life of the average person, which means that a person in 1000 BC was about as rich as someone in 1800, the average person for the entire world. And if you think about this, it's actually not too surprising. A person around 1000 BC would have lived a little over 30 years life expectancy, and someone in 1700, the average life expectancy was about 30 years. It really didn't change, and we'll talk a little bit in the next slide of why that is, but this period you could say is a Malthusian trap. And Malthusian trap says basically the population and income, or in this terms wages, are inversely related. Think of the economy as a large pizza. The more people there are, the smaller each person's slice is. Each slice is kind of their income or their wages. The fewer people there are, the bigger the slice is. So when the population goes up, wages go down. When the population goes down, wages go up. And this is basically the story of most of human history, until about 1800. And you can see there, the line splits into two. Sometimes they call this the Great Divergence. So some economies after 1800, mostly Western Europe, North America, Japan, and a few other places in the world, they became much, much wealthier than they were in the past. So they went from, let's say, a factor of 1 to about this time 12 times wealthier than they had been in the past. So, for example, in the United States, the average income per capita, income per person, is a little over $40,000 a year. But there's many places in the world where the average income is actually worse. It's something like maybe a few $100s a year. And about 40% of the world's population lives on less than $2 per day, which is saying less than $700 per year income. Now, most people where we live make more than that in a single week, including, let's say, even just middle-class public school teachers. Now, that's pretty good, right? We're a lot better off, we're richer, wealthier, we have a lot more people. And remember, this is income per person, which means each person is 12 times richer. But on top of that, if you remember that the population of the world has increased. In 1800, the population of the world was about 1 billion. The population now is 7 billion. So not only is the per person increased 12 times, if you times that by, let's say, 7, the factor the population has increased, really what we're talking about is a 70 to 80 times increase. That's like 8,000% increase, let's say, in the of the income or the productivity of the world. But this little down thing, if you look at the bottom here, you notice that you can see it tailing off. And what that's telling you is actually the rest of the world, most of the, let's say, we call developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, for example, like the island of Haiti, they're actually worse off. They're worse off than people were in, let's say, in ancient Egypt or ancient Greece. And this divergence is another basic fact about the modern world. Now, another way to look at this is that all these inventions that we think, change the world, the invention of iron and steel, the invention of trigonometry, paper, gunpowder, eyeglasses, the printing press, mechanical clock, all this technology made almost no change in, let's say, the material progress or the material level of the world. And I like to joke, though, because what's probably the most in class you should be taking, what came about around 1800 was the invention of calculus. And so this is my little, public service announcement to take calculus, most important class you'll take in high school. So around early 1700s, Isaac Newton and Leibniz both discovered calculus. This is actually relatively important, one of the more important, let's say, developments leading to the Industrial Revolution. And so you might say that calculus is a lot more important than all these other things you read about in history textbooks. Now, another way to look at this is that how the income of the world was distributed. So, in 1500, we can see in this graph is, think of the entire economy as like $1. The entire world economy equals $1. And we can use this to think of the percentages as how many cents of that dollar are, let's say, produced in different parts of the world. What share of the world's GDP, or gross domestic product, different parts of the world are producing. So in 1500, which is about the time, let's say, Columbus discovers America, we have the Ming Dynasty, more or less at its height in China, and we have the Mughal Empire in India. And at that time, about 25 cents of every dollar is produced in China, and about 23 cents of every dollar is produced in India. So it's about 48 cents, or almost 48% of the world's economy in those two regions. Now, compared to that, Europe, or Western Europe, meaning basically Germany over, is only producing about 17 cents of the entire world, 17 cents of that dollar, or 70% of the world's economy. So it's basically Europe alone is behind both India and China. And if you look at it as a combined area, Europe is basically only producing a third, almost, of what, let's say, South Asia and East Asia are producing. Even if you don't include Japan, even if you don't include some of the other countries in the Middle East, which were not in any sense backward at that time. So this is like at the dawn, let's say, of the rise, we could say, of Western civilization. So let me fast forward to 1820. So this is at the onset of the Opium War. Now, this is only about maybe 4 or 5 generations back, only about 190 years ago. And you can see, actually, China's doing a lot better. China's gone from 25% of the world economy to about 34%, or 34 cents of the dollar. China's doing a lot better. Now, what's going on in the world? So this is, remember, the Opium War. The British are going to fight China, several different wars to force them to import opium, which would be very destructive in the 19th century. You have the Industrial Revolution going on in Europe at this time, or at least It's in full swing in England, and is starting to pick up steam in the United States, France, and other places in Europe. But you can see already that India has just become a British colony. So the England lost its colonies in North America, and basically almost simultaneously established the Raj, or the English colonization of India. And you can see that India's kind of had a major decline of about 33%. What's happened in India? Well, a big part of what happened in India is that the Industrial Revolution, with the English producing all these textiles, almost deliberately went in and kind of, let's say, destroyed the basis of India's economy, which was producing textiles. And if you think of some fabrics that we have today, a lot of them hold names that suggest their origins in India, such as cashmere sweaters, or calico patterns, or madras pants. And the English knew that even though, despite the fact of the Industrial Revolution and the factories and their big textiles and power looms, that they really could not compete with the far advanced technology and textile industry of India. And they went in there and basically first went in with their army, the East India Company, and basically destroyed the basis of its economy, the textile industry in India. And that's actually what laid the basis for the English expansion and the growth of England and Western Europe. It wasn't simply that we were better or more competitive, but we actively went and destroyed our competition. So the English set themselves up in India. India has become a lot poorer, partially because of the wars going on between the different warring Maharajas in India, partially because of English involvement in there, but it's already taken a clear step back relative to the rest of the world. Okay, so that's 1820. So let's move forward to 1950, so about when many of your parents were born. And now you can see a really dramatic shift going on. Okay, you have a 10 times shrinkage in the share of the world's economy held by China. So remember, this is roughly the time the communists take over. So you've gone from 34% to 3%. Now Europe's only gone a little bit, let's say, more. They're about 23% of the world economy. India has gone down to 2. So think about what's happened here. Why did, let's say, Western Europe do so well? China kind of shrank. India shrank a lot, from about 10 times, 8 times from 1500 for China. This is a big kind of shift in the world's economy. These countries that were really far ahead, very advanced technologically, economically, in other ways, and you might argue even culturally, clearly fell behind Western Europe sometime in the 19th century. Now, many people like to explain these differences by looking at biology, such as Jared Diamond in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. But if it's really about biology or farm animals and domestication or these types of seeds, you would think you would see this dispersion happening a lot earlier. But clearly, the change really occurs. Europe, it doesn't really become distinctive economically until the 1800s, and the shrinkage for East Asia and India doesn't really happen until about the same time. So what happened? Well, here's one way to think about it. I mentioned before about that first graph I showed you about the Malthusian trap, which is basically that there's this kind of inverse relationship going on between population and income. In this graph, it's shown as real wages with 100